Okay, let's begin. A very good morning to all of you. So, today we'll be studying the pathology of the large intestine or the colon. Again, we divided into benign pathology and malignant pathology. In the benign pathology, we are going to study about inflammatory bowel disease today. Now, before we go on to the topic, I want to tell you in short about mucosa associated lymphoid tissue that you all must already be aware of. But just at the outset, I want to give a quick revision of this. So, as you have already read in your general pathology the topic of immunity, you have read about the how our immune system functions. Okay, and so you have all also studied about the different lymphoid organs, that is the lymph nodes, the spleen. Okay, so the lymphoid tissue is confined not only to the designated lymphoid organs, but it is actually distributed throughout the body, and the total lymphoid tissue that is distributed at the mucosal surfaces is called as the mucosa associated lymphoid tissue. So in my last lecture I had told you about the normal histology of the gastrointestinal tract that is made up of four layers, and we saw that in the mucosa contains a lot of lymphoid cells and even the submucosa, and at places like in the ileum, they are aggregated into masses which are called Peyer's patches. So right from the oropharynx to the anus, we throughout the GI tract, the lymphoid tissue is distributed. Somewhere it is arranged as a diffuse population, somewhere it is organized as a non-encapsulated aggregation similar to lymph node but non-encapsulated like the Peyer's patches. Okay, so the lymphoid tissue associated with gastrointestinal tract is what is called gut associated lymphoid tissue or GALT. The that associated with bronchial tree is called bronchial associated lymphoid tissue. In the oropharynx, we have got the Valdeir ring. Again, it is also component of the immune system. Okay, so similar to lymph node, they have got follicles with germinal centers. And why do we need this immune system? Because we know the gastrointestinal tract is exposed to a lot of foreign material. We take food, and the food contains a lot of antigenic material. It is all foreign to the body, and there are a lot of microbes and infectious agents as well to which our GI tract is exposed. Okay, so we need that this antigenic material should be sampled, and if it is found to be harmful, then our body must initiate the immune reaction, and both antibody mediated and cytotoxic immune responses are mounted wherever appropriate. So this immune system, it is quite complex, and it must function in an appropriate manner. So like you have already read about the abnormalities of the immune system, like if they the immune system, the primary function of our immune system is to mount a protective immune response, and once the offending agent has been removed, has been phagocytosed or has been neutralized, subsequently our immune system must be deregulated. It must be deregulated, otherwise whenever there is immune, so we know whenever there is immune activation, there is inflammation, and this inflammation has a damaging effect on the normal tissue as well. And once the function of the immune system is over, it must be deregulated, it must be suppressed, it must be inhibited, so that subsequently healing process can take place and homeostasis is restored. So our immune system, not only its activation but its inhibition at appropriate time is important, and it must function in a very regulated manner, and that is why we also have a regulatory component to our immune system, example being the T regulatory cells or what we call as Tregs. Okay, so when our immune system starts recognizing self antigens, the disorders that result are called the autoimmune disorders. When there is deficiency of immune system, we have the immune deficient disorders. Okay, so let's start with the topic. So this inflammatory bowel disease, if we just state in a simple sentence, then it is essentially a manifestation of inappropriate mucosal immune activation. Okay, now this inappropriate activation of the immune system, how does it occur? This is a result of a very complex interaction between various components And these components include the intestinal microbiota, the host immunity, and a very important is to have genetic susceptibility. So it is a result of interaction between the host immunity and intestinal microbiota in a genetically susceptible individual. So there is a very strong genetic component in inflammatory bowel disease. In genetically predisposed individuals, there occurs some alterations in the way these two systems are interacting. So we know our gut has got a complete microbiota, that is the microorganisms, including including all bacteria, fungi, viruses. Okay, and it is a very dynamic thing. It keeps changing throughout life, and the entire genome of the microbiota is what is called microbiome. So I'll be elaborating on this subsequently. Okay, so to make this diagnosis, it is very important to exclude the conventional infectious etiologies. Okay, so we must exclude the infectious etiologies before making diagnosis of inflammatory bowel disease, because essentially, okay, morphological presentation is there is a lot of inflammation going on, and this is like a chronic, long-standing inflammatory process. Okay, sometimes it can aggravate when the patient is said to have relapses. Sometimes it is suppressed, or is the inflammation is at the lowest level when the patient feels okay, normal. So patient is said to be in remission. So, and it is really a long standing condition. So it is a chronic condition that results from complex interactions between intestinal microbiota and host immunity in a genetically susceptible individual. Okay. So, what are the components of inflammatory bowel disease? It includes two diseases. It is divided into ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. So, these are the two terms that we use for these diseases. The pathogenesis is essentially the same. However, there are subtle differences in the genes that are involved, and also the distribution of the disease. So, ulcerative colitis essentially involves the rectum and variable parts of the colon. Crohn's disease can involve any part of the gastrointestinal tract, right from the esophagus to the anus. And the inflammation in ulcerative colitis is confined to the mucosa and submucosa. Okay, that is the superficial two layers of the gastrointestinal tract. So we know gastrointestinal tract is made up of four uh, different functional layers: mucosa, submucosa, muscularis propria, and the serosa or adventitia. So the first two layers, the innermost two layers, are involved in ulcerative colitis, while in Crohn's disease, it is transmural. What do we mean by transmural? Mural means the wall thickness, and trans means the entire wall thickness. So all the four layers, mucosa, submucosa, muscularis propria, and serosa, are involved in Crohn's disease. So, as I have already mentioned briefly, the pathogenesis, now we are going to elaborate on this. It is a combination of abnormalities in three factors: the immune system of the host, the interactions of the host with the microbe, epithelial barrier functions, and genetic susceptibility, as I told you, is the preliminary step. So let's elaborate on the genetic susceptibility. So this disease is polygenic in nature. Polygenic means there are a lot of genes that are involved, lot of genes. Now research is still going on, but till now we have almost identified more than 200 IBD associated genetic polymorphisms. And the strongest risk gene that has been identified in Crohn's disease is NOD2. Now, the specific genes that may be involved in Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, they vary. Variable genes are involved, and also the genes, two individuals suffering from the same disease will not have to have the same set of genes that are involved. So there are variable combinations of these genes. It's not that all of the genes are involved. It's not that a specific set of genes is seen in all the patients. So this is the variability of the genetic component. Okay, so you need to understand that this is how this is the variability in genetic component. Multiple genes are involved. Not all the genes are involved in all the patients, and they vary from individual to individual and also across ethnic groups. So not to polymorphisms in Asians have been found in Asian populations as well, but they are not associated with Crohn's disease. Okay, so ethnicity again is important, and with the different ethnic groups different genetic polymorphisms, different genetic involvement is found. And the risk alleles or the genes that are involved will have an influence on the disease phenotype. Disease phenotype is the morphological expression of the disease. Morphological expression meaning what part of the intestine is involved and how is it manifesting, what are the abnormalities that are being produced in the particular individual. So there is some correlation between the set of genes that is involved and the phenotype of the disease. Okay. So now this genetic component and the genetic susceptibility. So we have seen that because since there is a lot of variation in the genes involved, so that means it is the genetic component is not the only component that is responsible for disease pathogenesis. We have got other components as well. We have environmental factors, and as I have already told, the interactions, host microbe interactions, epithelial barrier functions, everything has an influence. Okay, so now all of these factors, the genetic factors as well as the environmental factors, they can be thought of as affecting either the mucosal immunity, or they can be affecting the host microbe interactions, the autophagy and cellular response. So let's see how they are affecting these components of the immune system. Okay, so in mucosal immunity, how can it be affected? Now, genes that are involved in immune signaling and immune regulation, as well as genes encoding for HLA molecules and cytokines, have been associated with IBD. Okay, so whatever genes that have already been identified to be involved in the pathogenesis of IBD, these are the genes which are involved. What are the functions of these genes? They are involved in immune signaling and immune regulation. Okay, so example, we have some genes are encoding for pro-inflammatory cytokines, example interferon gamma. Some of these genes are found to be encoding for anti-inflammatory signaling, immunoregulatory functions like interleukin 10 and interleukin 10 receptors. So from your prior knowledge of immune system, we know that interferon gamma has a pro-inflammatory effect, and interleukin 10 and interleukin 10 receptors, it has got anti-inflammatory effect. And these components are the ones that may be affected by these genetic polymorphisms and may be contributing to the pathogenesis. Okay, then Th1 polarization has been identified in both these diseases. Th17 signaling is also important in IBD pathogenesis, as has been both are linked to polymorphisms and interleukin 23 receptor. So this has already been found. Then now many of the genes that are linked to inflammatory bowel disease are also associated with other autoimmune diseases, including diabetes mellitus, rheumatoid arthritis, and psoriasis. So all these findings prove that these genes are essentially altering what? The mucosal immunity. And that is how it is. These are leading to inflammatory bowel disease. So the mucosal immune function is getting affected. Then how are they affecting the autophagy and cellular stress responses? So what is autophagy? Again, we have already read, just to revise, it is a normal homeostatic mechanism that clears out the damaged organelles. So whenever cells undergo damage due to any reason, all the damaged cellular material, the cell debris needs to be removed. It should be cleared out. All the damaged organelles need to be cleared out. Okay, autophagy also occurs in response to stress. Whenever the cell is subjected to any kind of stress in the form of like nutrient deprivation due to ischemia, there occurs a response in the cell, which is there occurs endoplasmic reticulum stress, and a response is generated, and in response to that, autophagy takes place. So it is also important to clear out all the reactive oxygen species and intracellular pathogens, okay, that result from the inflammation. So now when this autophagy and the stress response is defective, when there are defects in the autophagy and cellular response, it contributes to IBD pathogenesis. Okay, so two genes that are most studied in this context in autophagy are the ATG16L1 and IRGM genes, and both are involved in autophagosome formation. So ATG16L1 mutation promotes its degradation. So once if the mutation, this gene is mutated, so this protein will get degraded. Okay, so the autophagy will not take place. All right. So then this will contribute towards the pathogenesis. So these damaged tissues, organelles, the damaged organelles are not removed. They will continue to incite inflammation. Then reactive oxygen species are not removed. And so the inflammatory process continues. Now, Paneth cells in intestinal lining epithelium contain granules that house the antibacterial peptides, and these are released into the crypt lumen. Also, these granules are structurally and functionally abnormal in patients with ATG16L1 defects. So, in a normal scenario, these antibacterial peptides will be released in the crypt lumen in response to any offending agent. But in patients who have got defects in these genes, these granules are abnormal and they are abnormally functioning, and so they result in the inflammatory process and hence inflammatory bowel disease. Now, as I had mentioned about microbiome, now microbiome is quite complex and it has got a role in both health and disease. Microbiota refers to the microbial taxa that is associated with humans. That is all the organisms that are so closely associated with humans. They are present in our gastrointestinal tract and other mucosal surfaces, bacteria, fungi, viruses. All of these are included. And the entire catalog of these microbes and their genes is what is called microbiome. Okay, now microbiome is populated by a small number of species at the time of birth, but as the individual grows, it evolves to become more complex ecosystem, and many more uh, species populate our gut. So microbial complexity then subsequently with age, in old age, it again declines. So basically, what I want to emphasize on is that it is a very dynamic thing. It is continuously evolving with time. Okay, they and what is their function? They keep expressing proteins and molecules, they keep generating metabolites because they are living beings. They are also living, they're also functioning, they are also having their metabolism is going on, they are forming proteins, they are growing, they are dividing. Okay, so all of these have an influence on us. They can have protective influence, they can even exert, they can even promote disease. Okay. Examples, the Clostridia species will stimulate development of regulatory T cells. So it has a role in regulating the immune function. Bifidobacterium promotes Th17 differentiation. So these are the examples of how this microbiome affects us. So the microbes, the microbiota, it is a dynamic process. It keeps evolving, and our immune system also exerts an influence on the microbiome. So basically, these interactions, they are quite dynamic and they keep evolving with time. Microbial products, they activate. We know how they activate our cells of our immune system through toll-like receptors and lectin receptors, and also some intracellular receptors called microbial associated pattern receptors, which is NOD2. So they keep modulating our mucosal immunity. Similarly, our immune system, it can also alter the microbiome by mechanisms like luminal secretion of antimicrobial peptides, antibacterial immunoglobulin A. So this is how they keep interacting, and this interaction may evolve to result in dysbiosis. Dysbiosis meaning there's a shift in the microbial populations and reduced species diversity, and then this has an influence on the pathogenesis. It results in inflammatory bowel disease. Now, there is an entity called early onset inflammatory bowel disease. Unlike the common form of IBD, this is monogenic form. That is, not many genes are implicated, usually driven by single or few gene mutations. It is driven by mutations in single genes, like those required for epithelial ion transport, immune signaling, or host defense. Most common mutation in very early onset IBD is interleukin 10 receptor mutation. Macrophages produce excessive interleukin 1 beta in such infants, and they are therefore benefited from interleukin 1 receptor antagonist treatment. And same mechanisms may be involved in more common forms of IBD. So why we mentioned about early onset IBD? Since this is monogenic, so it is less complex. And if we know that a single gene is involved, and if we can give a targeted therapy, like we know interleukin 10 receptor mutation is resulting in early onset IBD. So if we give the antagonist for this receptor, then patients have been found to be benefited. So it has helped in understanding the pathogenesis of the polygenic form or the more common form of IBD. And we are all efficacy of similar treatment is now being evaluated for polygenic IBD as well. Now we come to the individual disease entities. Crohn's disease, as I've already mentioned, it can involve any part of the GI tract, but most commonly it involves the terminal ileum, the ileocecal valve, and the cecum. So this is the part that is been found to be involved or affected in most of the patients who are suffering from Crohn's disease. Okay. Now, in 40% of the patients, only small intestine is involved. In 30% of the patients, both small intestine and colon are involved, and in 30%, only colonic involvement can also be seen in Crohn's disease. All right. So now we come to the gross pathology. Gross pathology means how if we get a resection specimen, so what do we see? What are the findings? Or if we do colonoscopy, so what do we see? Okay. So, in very characteristic feature of Crohn's disease, which also differentiates it from ulcerative colitis, is the presence of skip lesions. What do we mean by skip lesions? So we know that there are multiple So there are multiple sites of involvement in Crohn's disease. You see, these are the multiple areas, and they are sharply delineated. And in between the part that in between these two affected regions, whatever segment of colon is, it is unaffected. Here again, this one is unaffected. Okay, so this is what is called as skip lesions. So skip lesions is a very characteristic feature of Crohn's disease, which is not seen in ulcerative colitis. Why? In ulcerative colitis, there is a continuous involvement of a segment. All right. So right from this is the rectum, and this is the descending colon, and there is a continuous involvement. We do not see any uninvolved segment in between. So there are no skip lesions in ulcerative colitis. So again, as I had mentioned at the outset, they both these diseases differ in their phenotype, in their morphological expression. And so here we see, so this is one gross feature that if present will help us to differentiate. Okay, this is Crohn's disease, there are skip lesions. Here there is continuous involvement, this is ulcerative colitis, right? So Crohn's skip lesion is characteristic feature of Crohn's disease and differentiates it from ulcerative colitis. Differences between Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis is a very important question for you people. So you really need to understand, so that if once you have an understanding, you will be able to write the differences yourself. Now, in a Crohn's disease, there is, as I had mentioned, there is transmural involvement. That is, all the four layers are involved, right from the mucosa to the serosa. So the entire wall is shows infiltration by inflammatory cells. There is a lot of edema, and there is inflammation, so the wall gets thickened, and it has a rubbery, it becomes rubbery in consistency as well. There, plus also, since it's a chronic process, so healing also keeps going on simultaneously. So there occurs submucosal fibrosis, and also a reactive hypertrophy of the muscular dystrophy. So all of these factors will contribute to stricture formation. So here we have a photograph of a segment affected by Crohn's disease. You see this, you see the thickness of the bowel here and thickness here. There is a thickening of the wall, and there is a circumferential thickening. So the lumen gets narrowed in this portion. You see here the lumen is narrowed. This is the diameter, while here this is the uninvolved part, and here the diameter is considerably more. So eventually, with time, what happens is there is complete narrowing of the bowel wall, and this is what is called as stricture. So stricture is another helpful feature to differentiate, because transmural inflammation is a feature of Crohn's disease, while we do not see it in ulcerative colitis. So when there is transmural involvement, when there is stricture formation, again we can say that this is Crohn's disease and not ulcerative colitis. So presence of strictures is another helpful differentiating feature, as it occurs commonly in Crohn's disease but only rarely in long-standing ulcerative colitis. Now, other features. Now, earliest lesion that we see in Crohn's disease is kind of it is an aphthous ulcer. Now, multiple such lesions. So you see this gross photograph here. Multiple such lesions, multiple such ulcers, they have kind of coalesced together to result in an elongated ulcer. This is an elongated ulcer. The long axis of this ulcer is along the axis of the bowel. So here, this is the axis of the bowel is this one, the horizontal axis, and this ulcer, it has got two axes, a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. The longest axis is the horizontal axis, and this horizontal axis is parallel to that of the bowel. So this is what is called as serpentine ulcers. Also, edema with resultant edema, there is loss of the normal mucosal folds. Now, ulceration with sparing of interspersed mucosa results in an irregular cobblestone appearance. So this is how a cobblestone looks like. So basically cobblestone, it how does it result? Because there is deep mucosal ulceration. Okay, so see, this is the endoscopic view. Here we are, the appearance of the mucosa is very much similar to this, and hence this is called as cobblestone appearance. This again is this is a resected specimen. So this is what we are seeing on endoscopy. This is what we are seeing in the resected specimen that we have received. So this is the normal a normal mucosa. Now, here again, there is, because of some edema, you see that the mucosal folds, there is sort of here in this region, you do not see the folds. Here we are still able to see some folds. There is edema here, and here there is there is cobblestone appearance, because in between there is deep mucosal ulceration, and this nodular submucosal thickening. Submucosa is thickened. This nodular submucosal thickening is taking place in between. So this results in the cobblestone appearance. Also, fissures can develop. frequently, very frequently, because there is transmural involvement. So these fissures, and when the inflammation extends deep, these fissures may even extend deep enough to become fistula tracts. That is abnormal communication between with other part of the bowel, or even they can even perforate. Now, other feature that we see is creeping fat. What is creeping fat? Normally, the fat is confined within the mesentery in a healthy bowel when there is no inflammation. Now, in Crohn's disease, what happens is this fat starts to extend over the serosal surface, and this is what is called as creeping fat. This is another schematic diagram to show. This is the fat normally confined to the mesentery, and here we are seeing that is also extending on the serosa. This is creeping fat. This is the unusual increase of mesenteric fat, and this is the resected specimen. Here again you see this is the normal shiny mucosa, sorry, serosa, and this is the attached mesentery where the fat is there, and here in this region this fat has creeped onto the serosal surface. Okay, so this is important to understand. I hope this must be clear. What do we mean by creeping fat? This is again a feature we see in inflammatory bowel disease. Now, so these were all the gross features. Now we will move on to the microscopic features. But before that, again, a quick revision of the normal histology. So this is the mucosa of the small intestine. It is thrown into these villi, multiple long villi. And in between these villi, we have short crypts called crypts of Liverpool. And in the colon, we do not have villi, rather we have got these long elongated crypts. Now, what is important to understand is that what is the normal architecture of the crypts? The crypts are all long and elongated. They are thin, elongated, just like test tubes stacked in a rack. Okay. So here we can imagine this as one test tube, as other test tube, as third test tube, and their bases all reach the muscularis mucosae. Their bases must reach. Like if see this script here, you can here it is basically the sectioning has been such that this script here at the base we are seeing only a cross section, and we are seeing it in a longitudinal form only up till here, but actually this is the same crypt. The base is reaching up to muscularis mucosae just like this crypt. So they are parallel to each other, they are not sort of intersecting, and they are non-branching. That is, there is a single elongated crypt. It does not, there are no outpouchings, there are no branchings, nothing. So this is the normal architecture, and the lining is columnar cells and essentially a lot of goblet cells. Okay, so why it is important? Because this architecture is basically, this architecture is lost. The crypts, they assume abnormal architecture in inflammatory bowel disease. Okay, so there are a lot of inflammatory cells in the mucosa. There are abundant neutrophils, and these inflammatory cells even start infiltrating into the epithelium, and they start destroying the epithelium. So here, if you see carefully, this is actually a crypt which is being destroyed by all these inflammatory cells. So they infiltrate into the, when these cells are infiltrating into the epithelium, and then so in between these epithelial cells, we look for these inflammatory cells. And this, when it is infiltrating into the epithelium, it is called cryptitis. When these neutrophils form cluster inside the lumen, so here this is a crypt lumen, and we see a lot of neutrophils sitting inside the lumen, we call it crypt abscess. Okay, so when the neutrophils are infiltrating in between the epithelial cells, it is called cryptitis. When they are reach and aggregate inside the lumen, it is called crypt abscess. And subsequently at a later stage, they may entirely destroy the crypt, like is happening here, and that is called crypt destruction. Okay, so cryptitis, crypt abscess, crypt destruction. So these are the microscopic features. And then and even ulceration. So these are the initial features. Then subsequently, the mucosa gets entirely ulcerated. So ulceration is a common feature in Crohn's disease. As we saw in the gross picture here, there is it starts with an ulcer, aphthous ulcer, then subsequently extends to form serpentine ulcer. Ulcer is breach in continuity of epithelium or mucosa. Okay. Now, there may be an abrupt transition between ulcerated and adjacent normal mucosa. Now, repeated cycles. So when these, so this, after this crypt destruction, subsequently there are attempts at regeneration as well. There are stem cells residing at the crypt bases, and they sort of try to regenerate those crypts. Okay, so when this process occurs repeatedly, what happens is that is in long standing cases, we get a distortion of the architecture. There is disorganization of all these mucosal glands. So vis-a-vis the normal architecture you see here, here the crypts are not really parallel to each other. They are very haphazardly arranged. They are not really same in size. See, this one is so small, this is so big and elongated. Then we also see these branching. You see this crypt, it is branching out. It is not a single tubular structure, rather there are a lot of branching. So this is what we mean by distortion and disorganization of the architecture. The normal straight and parallel crypts take on bizarre branching shapes and unusual orientations to one another. Okay, so this is a feature of chronicity. So this is a feature of chronicity. This is the feature of activity. Activity when active inflammation is taking place. So I had told you, patients of inflammatory bowel disease, they have a very relapsing remitting course. At a time, the inflammation may be very severe, and active destruction and active inflammation is going on. There is active destruction of the crypts. While when this bout of inflammation subsides, then when this bout of inflammation will subside, then the patient and healing process is taking place, then we will not see so much of inflammation, but because of the repeated attempt at inflammation and repeated attempt at inflammation, we see essentially this change in the architecture. So not much inflammation, but architectural distortion. So this is a feature of chronicity. This is a feature of activity in inflammatory bowel disease. Other feature of chronicity is epithelial metaplasia. So whenever a chronic inflammation process goes on, the lining epithelium undergoes a change, which is initially reversible. So a reversible change in which one differentiated cell type is replaced by another differentiated cell type is what we call metaplasia. It is an adaptive substitution by cells which is better able to withstand an adverse environment. This also we have already read in your general pathology chapters, metaplasia, why it occurs, and it's basically an adaptive response, okay, to this kind of stress situation. Now, what are the metaplasias that we can see? Pseudopyloric metaplasia, when the glands are replaced by gastric antral appearing glands. So here we see these are very much like those seen in the gastric antrum, these mucus glands. Okay, so this is pseudopyloric metaplasia. Why pseudopyloric? Because it appears like the glands in the pylorus, but G cells are lacking. So this is not a true pyloric metaplasia, but pseudopyloric metaplasia. The pyloric glands also contain the G cells, which secrete gastrin. But here we do not see that. So this is pseudopyloric metaplasia. Then here we see Paneth cell metaplasia. Now Paneth cells are normally seen in the small intestine. Again, we come to this. So here we see these reddish cytoplasmic granules. These are the Paneth cells. These are present normally in small intestine, and they are also seen in the to some extent in the right-sided colon, that is the ascending colon, but they are not seen in the left-sided colon. So when these start appearing in left colon, it is called Paneth cell metaplasia. So architectural and metaplastic changes may persist even when the active inflammation has resolved. So again, this is a feature of chronicity. So we may not be seeing an active inflammation going on, but we can say that this is a patient of inflammatory bowel disease on the basis of these features. When metaplasia is taking place, when there is architectural distortion, so these features of chronicity are present, we can say that yes, this patient is actually, these are the features which are seen in inflammatory bowel disease. This patient may be suffering from inflammatory bowel disease. Okay. Then mucosal atrophy and loss of crypts may also occur after years of disease. Now, the hallmark feature of Crohn's disease is presence of granulomas. Now, how do these granulomas differ from those seen in tuberculosis? They are essentially non-caseating granulomas. You do not see necrosis. Also, they are very tiny and they are maybe located in mucosa. If you see a mucosal granuloma, it is almost certain this is Crohn's disease and not tuberculosis. Okay. Then these are tiny. These are small. And these granulomas may be seen even in the region that is not really affected by active inflammation. So okay, so they may occur in areas of active disease or even in uninvolved regions, and they may also be seen in the draining mesenteric lymph nodes. Now, quickly, what are the clinical features? They are again very variable because it will depend on the morphological expression of the disease. So usually it begins as intermittent attacks of relatively mild diarrhea, fever, and abdominal pain. In acute presentation, 20% of the patients may present acutely, that is to the emergency, with severe right lower quadrant pain, fever, and bloody diarrhea. So it mimics acute appendicitis or even bowel perforation. So it can be that acute in presentation. Now, these periods of active disease are interrupted by asymptomatic periods. These asymptomatic periods can last for weeks to many months. Then disease reactivation can be associated with varying variety of external triggers. So generally patients have some triggers that result in reactivation of the disease or relapse or episodes of the disease, including physical, emotional stress, specific dietary items, cigarette smoking. Smoking is a strong risk factor for development of Crohn's disease. Disease onset, sometimes in some of the patients, the disease begins with the initiation of smoking. So then they start smoking, this disease may be precipitated. But unfortunately, if they stop smoking, the disease does not undergo remission. So once initiated, once the trigger occurs and the process is initiated, as we have seen, pathogens is quite complex. The disease process keeps continuing. It may not be that disease also undergoes remission. So that is just the triggering factor which will set on the process of disease, disease occurrence. And now, in long-standing diseases, what are the manifestations? Because of the long-standing inflammation, the absorption process is affected. So, patient can manifest as iron deficiency anemia because of the chronic blood loss, especially in patients who have colonic disease. Then there can be hypoalbuminemia and malnutrition because of the protein loss and malabsorption of nutrients, vitamin B12, bile salts in case of extensive small bowel disease. Fibrosing strictures, as I have already told you, in long-standing cases, strictures will develop. So, especially if in the terminal ileum, which is already a narrow segment, they're quite common, and sometimes surgical resection is required for these strictures because they may be obstructing. Disease often recurs at the site of anastomosis, and 40% of the patients require additional resections within 10 years. Fistulae can develop between two loops of bowel, and it can even involve the urinary bladder, the vagina. So, fistula is an abnormal communication between two hollow organs. So, these fistula can form a communication between two separate loops of bowel. A communication may be established between the bowel and the bladder, bowel and the vagina, like that. Then perforation and peritoneal abscess is common. So these are the manifestations of long-standing Crohn's disease. Now, Crohn's disease also has extra-intestinal manifestations. Any of these may develop before intestinal disease is recognized. Pericholangitis and primary sclerosing cholangitis occurs in individuals with Crohn's disease with much higher frequency than those without Crohn's disease. But they are even more common in individuals with ulcerative colitis. Also, risk of colonic adenocarcinoma is increased in patients with long-standing colonic disease. Okay, so any, as we have as we know, a long standing chronic inflammatory process eventually it becomes a risk factor for development of carcinoma, because it becomes a very fertile ground for mutations to take place, and some of these mutations may induce an oncogenic process in the epithelial cells and result in unregulated cell proliferation. So there can be multiple nodules on the skin in these individuals, uveitis, migrative polyarthritis, sacroiliitis. So essentially systemic involvements in inflammatory bowel disease, because this is a it is essentially an immune dysregulatory disease. Now, we can manage this by anti-inflammatory agents like salicylates or immunosuppressive drugs like corticosteroids, and now even biological therapies have come up like anti-TNF antibodies. So anti-TNF antibodies have really helped individuals with inflammatory bowel disease. Other biological therapies, including antibodies against some cytokines and cell adhesion proteins, which are found to be essential or necessary for inflammatory cell migration, have also been approved for clinical use. Now, it is not difficult to envision treatment algorithms that use the genetics, immune function, and microbial composition of individual patients to guide selection of targeted therapies. So, since the genes involved vary from patient to patient, since the microbiota is also something which is unique to a patient, so basically what is the need of the hour is to basically tailor the therapy, customize the therapy as per the need of patient. Okay, right. Now we begin to the second topic, the ulcerative colitis, which is the second component of inflammatory bowel disease. It is limited to the colon and rectum, and long-term outlook, again, it depends on the severity of active disease and the duration of the disease. Factors that trigger development of ulcerative colitis in previously healthy individuals are not really known. Enteritis, whenever there is inflammation, even infectious, due to some infectious etiology, it triggers mucosal immune activation and microbial changes that lead to disease in susceptible individuals. Psychological stress, which may also be linked to relapse during remission. So stress is also a triggering factor. Initial onset of symptoms has also been reported to occur shortly after smoking cessation in some patients. So smoking basically is protective in ulcerative colitis. Coming to the gross pathology. So it always involves the rectum and it extends proximally in a continuous fashion to involve part or all of the colon. So rectum is involved almost always, and then it will extend proximally and variable parts of colon are involved. So this is the region of the cecum and some part of the proximal colon, and we see the mucosa is all red and granular mucosa. And here we are seeing the smooth out mucosa. When the entire colon is involved, it is called pancolitis. When the disease is limited to a part, depending on the segment involved, we have different terms. When rectum is involved, it's just ulcerative proctitis. When rectum and sigmoid colon are involved, it is ulcerative proctosigmoiditis. Small intestine is essentially normal in ulcerative colitis, though if the entire colon is involved, then some inflammation, some amount of inflammation can be seen in the distalmost part of the ileum, that is the segment of ileum just adjacent to the um, cecum, and then it is called as backwash ileitis. It may be present in in severe cases of ulcerative colitis. Okay. Now, skip lesions are not seen in ulcerative colitis, as we have seen, as I had already told you. The involved colonic mucosa, here see, involved colonic mucosa, this is the involved mucosa. It is red and granular, and or it may have extensive ulcers. There is an abrupt transition between the diseased colon and the uninvolved colon. So you see there is an abrupt transition between the two segments of the colon. Now, ulcers are essentially broad-based ulcers and they are aligned along the long axis of the colon, but they do not typically replicate the serpentine ulcers of Crohn's disease. So, serpentine ulcers is a characteristic feature of Crohn's disease. Now, this is the region of the colon that is sort of affected, and the mucosal folds have sort of flattened out. There is edema, and this is the probably the regenerating mucosa. So, a regenerating mucosa in between two areas of affected mucosa will sort of bulge out, and this is what is called a pseudo polyp. So this is why it is pseudo polyp. It is not a true polyp. It is not really a projection from the surface, but just because the affected areas are sort of depressed, there is a flattening, there is an atrophy or loss of mucosal force. So this area, intervening area, or the regenerating mucosa appears to be bulging. So they are pseudo polyps. Okay, here again we are seeing a lot of these pseudo polyps, and tips of these polyps can coalesce, like here it is happening here, and so these mucosal bridge formation takes place. So pseudopolyps is a feature of ulcerative colitis. Now, chronic disease will result in mucosal atrophy and smooth mucosal surface that lacks normal folds, as we have seen here. Okay. Now, colon wall is not thickened, like unlike in Crohn's disease. So in Crohn's disease, we saw there is thickening of the wall and it results in stricture formation. Here, there is mucosal atrophy and the colonic wall is not thickened. The serosal surface is normal and strictures do not occur in ulcerative colitis. Okay. So stricture again is a feature of Crohn's disease and not ulcerative colitis. Uncommonly severe cases are associated with inflammation of muscularis propria and neuromuscular dysfunction that results in colonic dilatation. Colonic dilatation, which is called toxic megacolon. So this, you see how this is almost a balloon-like distension of the colon. This is what is called toxic megacolon, because this may occur also because of neuromuscular dysfunction. Okay. And this carries a risk of perforation. So in Crohn's disease, it is the strictures, it is the ulcers which may extend deep and result in perforation. In ulcerative colitis, it is the thinning of the wall and this abnormal distension that carries the risk of perforation. Okay, so you see how much this bowel wall is distended. Toxic megacolon. Coming to microscopic features, again, what we see is they are similar to Crohn's disease. Inflammatory infiltrates are seen in the mucosa. There is a significant increase in these inflammatory cells. Then there is here. This is what is a crypt abscess. So here, if you see this crypt, if the neutrophils are infiltrating in between the epithelial cells, this is cryptitis, and when they're forming an aggregate within the lumen, this is called as crypt abscess. And here, crypt distortion, and this is a pseudo pyloric epithelial metaplasia. similar to what we see in Crohn's disease. If we look at photomicrograph of Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, so we see inflammation is extending throughout the wall. These are the multiple granulomas present throughout the wall in Crohn's disease. While in ulcerative colitis, the inflammation is confined to the mucosa and the submucosa max. The muscularis propria is all neat and clean. Okay, so this is not transmural. This is a photomicrograph of a long-standing case where we of ulcerative colitis. So here we see this is submucosal fibrosis, mucosal atrophy. The mucosa is significantly reduced in thickness. We are seeing very less of crypts, and whatever crypts are present, they are all very haphazardly arranged. They are of variable size. There is some branching of the crypts as well. Okay, so this is basically the residua of healed disease, and the histology can revert to normal if a period of prolonged remission exists. So it's not that it is entirely irreversible. If patient goes into remission for a long period of time, then the histological features can even revert to normal. So this is the submucosa, which normally is very loose, comprises of loose connective tissue and a lot of blood vessels, nerves. But here what we are seeing is all fibrosis. It is also a relapsing disorder, which is characterized by attacks of bloody diarrhea with stringy mucoid material, lower abdominal pain, and cramps that are temporarily relieved by defecation. These symptoms can persist for days, weeks, or months before they subside. Initial attack may be severe enough to constitute a medical or surgical emergency. So this can also have an acute presentation in a proportion of patients. More than half of the patients will have clinically mild disease, although almost all experience at least one relapse during a 10-year period. So this is a relapsing disorder. Extraintestinal manifestations are also seen in ulcerative colitis, just like Crohn's disease, migrating polyarthritis, sacroiliitis, ankylosing spondylitis, uveitis, and also skin lesions. And 2.5 to 7.5% of the patients can have primary sclerosing cholangitis. Now, 30% of the affected patients require colectomy. So, if suppose 100 patients are suffering from ulcerative colitis, 30 of them will require colectomy within first 3 years because of their uncontrollable symptoms. But incidence of colectomy has now fallen sharply because of the improvement in medical management. We have got a lot of medical therapies, again, the biologicals, the anti-TNF antibodies that are effective in Crohn's disease. They're also effective in ulcerative colitis. Some Crohn's disease treatments are, however, ineffective in ulcerative colitis, and this again is because of the differences in their molecular mechanisms, differences in the genes that are implicated in the two diseases. So they are not entirely overlapping. So to summarize, I will summarize the topic in the form of these differences between Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. So Crohn's disease can involve any part of the gastrointestinal tract, but the commonly involved site terminal ileum, ileocecal valve, and the cecum. Variable part of colon can be involved. Ulcerative colitis involves rectum and colon only. Distribution, again, skip lesion is a feature of Crohn's disease, while ulcerative colitis is essentially a diffuse involvement of the bowel. We don't have skip lesions. Stricture is a feature of Crohn's disease. It is rare in ulcerative colitis. Wall is thickened in Crohn's, while it is not thickened. It is normal or maybe reduced in thickness in ulcerative colitis. Among the microscopic features, inflammation extends throughout the thickness of the wall. That is transmural inflammation in Crohn's disease. It is limited to the mucosa and submucosa in ulcerative colitis. Pseudopolyps is a feature of mainly of the Crohn's disease. We see many, it's a marked involvement by pseudopolyps, while they are may be seen in Crohn's disease. Ulcers are deep knife-like serpentine ulcers. Here we have got more superficial and broad-based ulcers because of the superficial inflammation. Lymphoid reactions are marked in Crohn's disease, while they are moderate in ulcerative colitis. Fibrosis is quite marked in Crohn's disease, resulting in stricture formation. It is again mild or may not be seen in ulcerative colitis. Serositis is a feature of Crohn's disease because the inflammation extends throughout the thickness of the bowel. It also involves the serosa. Serositis is, there may be mild serositis in ulcerative colitis, but it is not so prominent. Granulomas are seen in almost 30 to 35% of the patients of Crohn's disease. These are tiny, non-caseating mucosal granulomas, may be seen in other layers of the bowel wall as well. While granulomas are not seen in ulcerative colitis, so they are not seen in ulcerative colitis. Fistulae and sinuses are a feature of Crohn's disease, while they are not seen in ulcerative colitis. Now, perianal fistula. Fistulas are seen in Crohn's disease. They are not a feature of ulcerative colitis. The fat and vitamin malabsorptions are also seen in Crohn's disease because of the involvement of the small intestine here. So the process of absorption, the major proportion of absorption of nutrients occurs in the small intestine. So it is not seen in ulcerative colitis. Malignant potential is seen in both. Both these diseases have a potential to undergo malignant transformation. Crohn's disease, when there is colonic involvement in ulcerative colitis, uh, it is essentially involvement of colon. So this definitely has a malignant potential. Recurrences are common in Crohn's disease after surgery, while they are not seen in ulcerative colitis. Generally, after surgeries, patients undergo remission. Here, the recurrence can occur even at the site of anastomosis. Toxic megacolon is a feature of ulcerative colitis and not of Crohn's disease. This table is from the Robbins textbook. And so with this, we conclude the topic of inflammatory bowel disease.